Hello everyone, and welcome back to the video by me, the WitcherGeorge. There is surprisingly little information on the dwarves in The Witcher. We know they are one of the elder races, which include gnomes and elves, but did you know that dwarves were actually on the continent before elves? This makes them one of the oldest races in the entire continent, definitely more so than humans. And I'm surprised that I've never actually talked about them before. I think the story of the dwarves is interesting, but it is shrouded in mystery. So today what I want to do is discuss dwarves and give a general overview of their place on the continent, as well as answer some questions about where they might be from and what their position is in the continent today. So, dwarves are a small humanoid race in the world of The Witcher, but despite their size are surprisingly strong, in fact stronger than the average human. They reach maturity around the age of 55 when their beards reach their waist, meaning that if you extrapolate this age, they possibly have a lifespan 2 to 3 times longer than a human. So let's say 200 to 300 years, something like that, if you have a human that lives naturally and completely healthily. Although this is just a guess. Furthermore, they arrived in the world of the Shea, which is the world the Witcher games take place in, long before humans and even before the Shea, making them one of the oldest sentient beings on the continent. I've seen some information saying they arrived 3,000 years before humans, 5,000 years before humans, but it's very hard to get a specific number because obviously written history does not go back that far. So it's something that you can just assume it was a long time before humans because it was before elves. So where the dwarves came from is a mystery, as like most other races, they arrived during the conjunction of the spheres, which is a confusing thing in itself. But the dwarves' homeworld, I like to imagine, is similar to the habitats they tend to inhabit. So mountains and caves, perhaps their world is a vast mountainous region, or perhaps it's a world filled with large cave systems, it could be a combination of both, or perhaps it's just a world that's quite similar to the world of the Shea, which, as you know, in itself is quite similar to our world's geography. So it could just be a normal world and they just happen to end up in a very similar world. But as I said, we don't actually know anything about this world, but we can just assume that based on the habits of the dwarves and what they tend to do, at least in the continent, is probably something to do with mountains and caves and carving their homes into stone, that kind of thing. There are female and male dwarves, although so far we haven't encountered a specific female dwarven character, save for mention of Eudora, who was engaged to Zoltan Chivay before their engagement was called off. I imagine that dwarven women's personalities are similar to the males, very straightforward but generally honest and friendly, but who knows, perhaps they are completely different to the sort of dwarf we normally encounter. There is no obvious reason why, but dwarven women appear to not venture out of the dwarven homeland, perhaps because of the prejudice from the local human populations, or maybe it's just a part of dwarven culture that dwarven women tend to not leave their home. But interestingly, they are said to be bearded like the male dwarves. The dwarves' language is dwarvish, and is famous for its wide use of swearing, although in recent years young dwarves have taken to speak to each other in the common tongue, leading to a decline in the use of the language. Hence, young dwarves now use a mix of common tongue filled with the swear words of their people, which has also transitioned into the normal common tongue, so you can sort of see this cross-cultural influence of, I suppose, dwarven language in this sense. But I imagine dwarvish is still widely spoken in Mahakam. Speaking of which, since the rise of humanity, the only known remaining dwarven stronghold is Mahakam, and the only known dwarven settlement that at least has been written in the Witcher games, and I suppose you could say just the lore in general, is Vergen. So let's begin with a brief discussion on Mahakam. Mahakam has a long history that I may go over in more detail in the future, but it is essentially the continental home of the dwarves and gnomes. It is a large mountain stronghold consisting of multiple dwarven enclaves, the capital being Mount Carbon, and no one can enter it except for dwarves, gnomes, and possibly halflings, although that is something that I personally sort of doubt. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I don't see why not. However, every 25 years during the famous Mahakam Ale Festival, anyone can enter, no matter if they're human, elf, whatever, and enjoy the hospitality of the dwarves. There are other exceptions, such as when holding an artifact called a Leiden Ring, which was given to a human king by Bruvahug as a gift. I hope I'm saying his name correctly, it's a difficult name. And the ruler of Mahakam is elected essentially by the ruling local dwarven clans, and they select someone from within them that they all respect or agree on, and that dwarf will become the elder-in-chief of Mahakam and rule over it for life. The Elder-in-Chief rules Mahakam with essentially absolute authority, except technically Mahakam is a vassal state of Temeria, although Temeria has no real control over the region and it is effectively an autonomous state, as should anyone hope to impose regulation or invade it, they would flood their valuable mines, destroying any perceived value to the region. But Mahakam doesn't just produce its own goods, it also acts as an interesting entry point for Nilfgaardian goods into the Northern Realms, as these goods are able to enter Mahakam by passing Temeria's taxation, and then flow into Temeria and the rest of the Northern Realms with relative ease. In fact, this was a big issue following the First Northern War. Foltest was powerless to do anything, as shutting the borders of Mahakam would greatly affect Temeria's economy and lead to objection from the Merchants Guild. So I think it's important to consider how important Mahakam, and in essence the Dwarves, are to the economies of both Nilfgaard and the Northern Realms. And Mahakam architecture is said to be pretty consistent with most Dwarven constructions, so it's great Dwarven halls carved into mountain rock, bearing Dwarvish runes and the stories of old, and technological marvels of Gnomish and Dwarven craftsmanship. Which leads to an important point of note. Dwarves are excellent craftsmen, creating a variety of high-quality weapons and armour, but they also use their incredible abilities to build their great mountain halls, a skill humans still appear to have not fully mastered. Despite Mahakam being the only known Dwarven stronghold, there is actually a Dwarven town located in Upper Edirn known as Vergen. Although the population is not entirely Dwarves, it is also some humans and some other races put in there. The town began after the Dwarves established mines in the region, eventually forming a town, that can actually be visited in The Witcher 2 should you opt for Eorvis path. Interestingly, the nearby human settlements failed due to constant fighting across the Pontar Valley, meaning Vergen is largely the only place in the region of any true value. It's important to note that in The Witcher, Vergen is the only mentioned Dwarven town, but this doesn't necessarily mean there aren't more in the Northern Kingdoms or beyond. It's just the only one that we actually know about. But dwarves aren't only found in Vergen and Mahakam, as they have also integrated pretty well into human society due to an innate ability to adapt to new neighbours easily. Now, dwarves can be found in many major cities, towns, and sometimes even small villages of the Northern Kingdoms. Generally you'll see dwarves as merchants and smiths and mercenaries for hire. But of course dwarves also exist in a variety of jobs, as their integration into human society has grown greater and greater. An interesting example being Cleaver, a dwarf that ran a gang of primarily dwarves in Novigrad. Interestingly, it is also speculated this dwarf can be deceased at the end of The Witcher 3, but he can be found regardless of your ending, so this is a bit undetermined. But regardless, this dwarf is interesting because he was one of the big four of Novigrad and was, well, a non-human. Despite their general peaceful coexistence, there has also of course been issues with the humans, as every race experiences issues with the humans. There have been recent pogroms, which led to many dwarves joining the Scoia'tael. They plait their hair to signify their allegiance against human expansion and domination. These dwarves often fight against human discrimination and overreach, which many argue actually increases human disdain for what humans refer to as the non-humans, but you can debate whether or not that's something that they actually care about or not. I seem to remember in one Witcher 3 ending, if you let the mages go free and don't kill Radovid, the dwarves are actually persecuted directly in Novigrad and throughout the Northern Kingdom, so that's something to bear in mind when you decide whether or not the dwarves were correct or not for joining the Scoia'tael, I suppose. So I wanted to add another point about Nilfgaard, as I think this is a particularly interesting area because we don't know a lot about Nilfgaard, but you could assume that dwarves are also in Nilfgaard, and I think that's a pretty safe assumption, and in fact I believe it is confirmed in the lore. So dwarves are not only bound to the Northern Kingdoms. Of course all dwarves are from Mahakam, at least in the current Witcher lore, but they still spread out throughout human society. They have really entered human society, not just in the north, but also in Nilfgaard. And I'd like to imagine, and I think this is true, that dwarves in Nilfgaard are treated far better generally than in the Northern Kingdoms. In the Northern Kingdoms there seems to be a lot of discrimination against the dwarves and the elves, and I think in Nilfgaard, obviously the humans are in charge, but it seems to be a little bit more accepting of it, despite Nilfgaard being far more expansionist. A good example would be Dor Blathanna, a kingdom that Nilfgaard essentially said, okay, you elves can run this and we won't really bother with you, but you are part of our empire. And I suppose that's better than not existing at all or being persecuted. You can debate that again, but I think that's an interesting thing to consider. I'd love to see Nilfgaard and see how dwarves and elves are treated in that region of The Witcher, something we really don't get to see. So to conclude, I'd just like to say that I think dwarves are one of the most interesting parts of the Witcher lore, as I believe most parts of the Witcher lore are pretty interesting, but dwarves especially, they're something that I've always been fascinated with when I've looked into fantasy and stuff like that. I think it's a particularly interesting part of the lore. I love their architecture, I love the music that seems to go with their kind of culture. I think it's a great part of the lore, and I'd love to just make a little video describing what they are, their general overview, and I hope you guys have enjoyed it. So thanks for watching today's video, guys. If you enjoyed it, please like it to let me know you enjoyed it, subscribe if you're new for more videos, be sure to go and follow my ex, and yeah, if you guys want to support me on Patreon and help me make more videos like this and stuff like that, I really would appreciate it, but don't feel the need to do that. If you want to do that, thank you so much, guys. Thanks for watching today's video, and I'll see you in the next one. Have an awesome rest of the week.